Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little colder than most bedtime tales. The complete history of anthrax, the white powder of biological terror. Forget the Hollywood versions. No smoky villain lairs or dramatic showdowns. This history is quieter, more clinical, and far more unsettling in its restraint. The truth is, you wouldn't face a roaring beast so much as an invisible danger that has undone people, frightened communities, and forced governments to rethink what safety even means. Before you get too comfortable, give the video a like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's incredible to see viewers joining in from every corner of the world. Silence your notifications, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The earliest murmurs of anthrax are written not on the spines of books but on clay tablets and in the quiet, exact notes of shepherds who counted beasts as if they were a household's pulse. On the low, silted plains of the Tigris and Euphrates, where the city-states of Sumer and later the empires of Babylonia kept careful records of cattle, sudden die-offs were more than an annoyance. They were an economic earthquake. Some of those cuneiform fragments that survive, catalogued by patient archaeologists, record lists of losses, decrees about redistribution of animals, and ritual instructions for burial and purification after episodes they called by names no modern tongue can translate without interpretation. Scholars have argued, plausibly and cautiously, that a number of those episodes, rapid collapse of herds, blackened sores on hides, contamination of pastures, map well onto what we would now call anthrax. The evidence is circumstantial and old, stained by time, but telling in its details, orders to burn carcasses, to sequester the hides, to keep traders away. These are not the words of people expecting a natural ebb and flow of livestock. They are the words of communities whose livelihoods were being undermined by something that returned from the earth again and again. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the picture repeats in different textures. Egypt's Nile floodplain, Anatolia's rolling pastures, the grazing lands of Greece. In the language of the classical world, the word anthrax, literally coal in Greek, had already been coined for a reason. When Hippocrates, writing in the late 5th and early 4th centuries before the Common Era, described a malignant sore that blackened like a coal and would not heal, the term anthrax stuck. It was vivid and accurate in a practical sense. Cutaneous anthrax produces the black eschar that looks, as an observer might say, like a piece of charcoal stuck to the skin. For practical agrarian societies, this was no abstraction. Shepherds and tanners who handled hides and fleeces began to notice patterns. A scabby hand in a tanner's trade, a brigand of sores on the arm of the man who skinned an ox, sometimes the animal itself dead overnight, swollen and bloody, the hide dark and foul-smelling as if burned from within. Roman agricultural manuals and encyclopedists, writing into the first centuries of the Common Era, recorded their own varieties of folk epidemiology. Columella and Varro wrote at length about the care of cattle and the hazards that could devastate a farm. Pliny the Elder, ever the collector of nature's curiosities, folded into his natural history a catalogue of animal maladies and the remedies that people tried for them. Sometimes the remedies were practical: burn the straw, bury the carcass, avoid moving suspect animals into clean herds, and sometimes they were ritual: appease the gods, wash with aromatic concoctions, anoint wounds with bitter herbs, and hope for divine mercy. In towns where tanning was a trade bordering on filth and fertility, the stench of hides and the scabbed hands of tanners became part of the urban fabric. Trade routes, those sinews of an ancient economy, carried wool, hides and bone across the Mediterranean and into the hinterlands. So too they could carry the invisible residue of what, to modernize, would be understood as resilient spores. Trade was the subtle courier of calamity. From the Anatolian plateaus, Thracian pastures, and the Black Sea regions came fleeces and hides that were prized in the wearing and furnishing of the wealthy. Ports like Byzantium, Alexandria, and Ostia were nodes where bundles of raw materials stacked alongside grain and ceramics. A contaminated hide tucked into a merchant's pack and shipped across the sea could travel far further than any shepherd. The movement of materials multiplied contact between animals and humans, and between whole economies and a disease that did not respect borders. Small economies could wobble. A tannery that lost a seasoned stock of pelts to suspicious mortality would ripple through a local economy. Butchers, cartwrights, muleteers, merchants, in societies where cattle were a store of value and labour, the unexpected disappearance of beasts could mean famine. loss of draft power, a crisis of tax receipts to overlords. The scale was practical and diplomatic. A city-state suffering an epizootic might default on grain shipments. A trading port might see ships rerouted. Neighbours might close their gates. How did pre-modern societies respond when faced with this stubborn enemy that seemed to inhabit hides and soil? Their responses were a mixture of observation, ritual, and proto-public health, sometimes tender, sometimes draconian, always improvisational. Common sense containment was often the first rule. Isolate the sick, burn or bury the dead, move animals away from the suspected pasture. The idea of quarantine, later formalised in medieval port statutes and early modern city ordinances, has antecedents here in simple prohibitions. Keep the trader out, do not accept hides from that region, wash the hands before handling animals. There were also religious and cultural responses that prescribed purification rites, offerings to Asclepius or Apollo, prayers for the restoration of flocks. Tanners rubbed poultices into sore hands, tried cauterization, smeared bitter herbs. Farmers salted and burned the bedding, changed grazing patterns, and, where possible, selected for animals that seemed less affected. The remedies were rarely effective at preventing recurrence. They were responses to the immediate crisis and also to the need to make sense in a world where invisible enemies were suspected to be divine or demonic. In the end, the common thread of antiquity was a pragmatic recognition of some truths, that the disease could pass from animal to animal, that it could lurk where the dead were left, that hides and wool could conceivably carry danger into new places. Those observations did not map yet onto a microscopic explanation, but they were accurate enough to become folk rules. Bury the dead deep, burn the hides, keep strangers' animals at bay. For centuries, that patchwork of customs, law and ritual was all the human world had to resist an organism that preferred the long silence of soil to the brief heat of life. Centuries folded, and the world changed its dominant instruments of knowledge from prayers and poultices to lenses and glassware. The mid-19th century opened like a room in which someone had finely lit a lamp. France and Germany, England and the scattered scientific ateliers of Europe were increasingly obsessed with the visible and the culturable. What could be seen under the microscope? What could be coaxed into life on a plate of media? What could be reproduced and therefore interrogated? In that slow and deliberate revolution, anthrax took on a new and central role. It was, for bacteriology, what a single simple melody is to an orchestra: clear, testable, and devastatingly informative. Where other diseases were tangled in vectors, multi-host life cycles, and uncertain empirical evidence, anthrax presented a more tractable set of puzzles. It affected large domestic animals and could be reproduced experimentally in smaller laboratory animals. The causative agent could be seen in the blood of the sick and, crucially, could be manipulated outside the body in ways that made causation demonstrable. A number of observers in the earlier 19th century had seen rod-like bodies in diseased blood. In France, the physician Casimir Devane found bacillary forms associated with what he called splenic fever in the 1860s, and he suggested a link between those rods and the disease, though the idea was contested. These were accurate eyes, but the techniques to satisfy a sceptical scientific world were not yet refined. That refinement arrived with Robert Koch in Germany. In 1806, working in the period when he was establishing himself, Koch published experiments that for the first time drew a clear line from observation to causation. In a language as precise as his instruments, he showed that a particular rod-shaped organism, Bacillus anthracis, was found in sick animals, could be isolated, and when introduced into healthy animals reproduced the same disease. He also made a key discovery about the organism's resilience, a life stage that could survive outside the living host, patiently waiting in soil until a susceptible animal arrived. These ideas, later enshrined in what became Koch's postulates, provided the laboratory a moral and operational framework: find the organism in disease, grow it, reproduce disease, and recover the organism. Anthrax fit that model with an almost cruel obedience. It became the textbook case that transformed speculation into demonstrable causation. The laboratory matured around such proof. The practical tools, stains to make bacteria visible, the invention of solid culture media, the glass dishes and plates that kept colonies spatially distinct, were not separate from the understanding of disease. They were the levers by which that understanding turned. A woman named Fanny Hesse suggested the use of agar in bacteriological culture. Julius Petri gave the world the shallow dish that bears his name. Ferdinand Cohn systematized bacteria into taxonomies and highlighted the existence of spores in certain rods. Each instrument, each methodological refinement, served to make bacilli less like ghosts and more like discrete entities that could be interrogated, counted, and crucially attenuated. Louis Pasteur, ever the showman and ever the careful experimentalist, seized the opportunity anthrax presented not only for theory but for practice. In a famous public demonstration at Pouilly-le-Fort on May 5, 1881, Pasteur organised a test that was as much political persuasion as it was science. Vaccinated animals, unvaccinated controls, an audience of journalists and rural onlookers, and the careful recording of outcomes. Vaccinated sheep survived the challenge that felled unvaccinated ones. The image, plaid shepherds, laboratory men in frock coats, and a practical demonstration that a laboratory intervention could protect a working farm, had enormous power. Pasteur's victory was not simply that he could make animals healthy, it was that he made the processes of laboratory science legible and useful to a broader public. Governments took notice. Ministries that had once been content with ritual or restricted trade now had a new policy tool: vaccination, coupled with diagnosis, regulation of movement, and standards for slaughter and disposal. The establishment of bacteriology as a formal science was thus won in part in the arena of anthrax. The rivalry between Koch and Pasteur, part scientific, part nationalistic, drove methodological refinement. Koch's rigorous, sometimes austere experimentalism set standards for proof. Pasteur's pragmatic interventions brought science into social life. Each pushed the other, often with the intensity of political theatre, and both created an infrastructure. Laboratories, journals, institutes, conferences. Pasteur founded institutions in Paris. Germany built its own research milieus in Berlin, Wroclaw, and elsewhere. The result was not only knowledge about Bacillus anthracis, but a set of preventative strategies: vaccination of livestock, regulations about hides and tanneries, public health campaigns that would alter the logistics of trade and agriculture on a continental scale. Medicine scaled up from the single patient to entire herds and to economies dependent on animal labour and material. If the 19th century taught us to see anthrax under glass and to prevent it with a vaccine, the organism itself taught us something more unsettling about endurance and ecology. Bacillus anthracis is not merely a bacterium that causes disease, it is a master of waiting. Conceptually, it lives in two modes: a vegetative mode in which it grows, divides, and produces the toxins that devastate a host, and a spore mode in which it becomes almost inert, an anatomical capsule that tolerates desiccation, heat, and time. When a grazing animal dies of anthrax, the carcass becomes a crucible. The bacterium, released into the exposed tissues and blood, undergoes a life cycle transition, as oxygen and the drying environment encourage the formation of hardy spores. Those spores are the currency of the soil. They fall to the ground, seep into crevices, coat the bones, and hide. For pastoral societies and for managed herds, the sight of one animal's death can become for decades a point of danger, an anthrax graveyard, where any grazer that roots or licks might acquire a lethal inoculum. This ecological durability makes anthrax less a disease of continuous transmission than of episodic exposure. Outbreaks are often localized and cyclical, tied to the particular histories of place. In some parts of the world, certain calcareous soils, river and floodplains, or the alkaline stretches favoured by ungulates, spores find conditions they tolerate well. Environmental factors conspire. A drought can force animals to root for fodder and ingest soil. Heavy rains can disperse spores. Construction, excavation or flooding can expose previously buried bones. Human activities too shape the pattern. The movement of livestock along trade routes, the concentration of animals in market towns, the import and processing of hides and bones for tanneries and fertilizer all redistribute the resilient powder of spores. It is proper to speak of anthrax as a zoonosis in the most literal sense. It is an illness that belongs to animals and spills into human communities through contact and commerce. The clinical presentations in humans are reflections of the roots of exposure. Cutaneous anthrax is the most historically common form, beginning at a point of contact on the hand of a tanner, the wrist of a butcher, with a small papule that soon darkens, ulcerates and forms the characteristic black eschar surrounded by swelling. It is, in many ways, the disease that medieval tanners mourned. It is ugly but historically survivable with proportionally higher rates than other forms if recognised and managed. The inhalational form, wool sorter's disease, took an enormous psychological and social toll in the 19th century as industrial wool pressing and sorting concentrated fibres and dust in mills and warehouses. A worker who had handled contaminated wool might inhale a cloud of particles that carried a few spores down into the lungs. The disease could then progress rapidly to a fulminant pneumonia and systemic syndrome. The term wool sorter's disease engraved itself into the vocabulary of industrialising Europe because it described both an occupational hazard and a new kind of invisible risk in modern manufacturing. Gastrointestinal anthrax, rara, came from ingestion of poorly cooked contaminated meat or, historically, from other contaminated animal products. Each presentation was different, but each traced back to the same ecological truth. A spore, quiet and patient, had found a way into a living body. Because the organism's persistence is environmental, the strategies that history accumulated to control it are as much about landscape management and industrial logistics as they are about medicine. Burial of carcasses, while sensible, can be insufficient if done without depth or in wet areas where erosion will later expose remains. Burning, when possible, disposes of biomass and reduces the chance of spore formation, but fuel and labour were often in short supply. Regulations on hides and bone for fertiliser factories proved more decisive in certain eras. By insisting on processing standards, by inspecting shipments, by diverting tanneries away from dense urban quarters, communities could reduce the frequency of human contact with contaminated materials. Vaccination of livestock, first demonstrated in a laboratory and then scaled in pastures, altered the calculus more drastically. An effective veterinary campaign turned a landscape of repeated epizootics into one of occasional and controllable events, yet the spore did not disappear. It retreated into the soil, into the bones, into the crevices of a world heavily trafficked by beasts and men alike. Anthrax's story is thus a story of scale, from a shepherd's observation of one dead animal to the networks of trade that moved hides across empires, from a single laboratory bench where a rod was identified and cultivated to national governments implementing vaccination schemes and meat inspection services. The organism both exploited and revealed the logistics of human society, how we move goods, how we feed ourselves, how we concentrate labour. It favoured the places where humans were also at their busiest: tanneries, docks, slaughterhouses, the concentrated arteries of commerce. And because it lived long in the ground, the battle with anthrax became not a single campaign, but a slow project of surveillance, management, and occasional emergency response. The policies that emerged — regulate the hides, inspect the meat, vaccinate the flocks, educate the workers — are practical, bureaucratic measures that moved governments and economies rather than generals. The scale of the response matched the scale of the threat. And yet there is a certain mordant irony, not lost on those who write histories at night, that anthropologists and microbiologists alike have noticed. The microbe that most clearly proved germ theory and the utility of laboratory science is also one that delights in the spaces where our industry leaves detritus. The modern laboratory turned anthrax from a riddle into a model organism. It gave us the language and the tools to limit its damage. But the spore never took part in those debates. It continued, indifferent, to lie in the soil of floodplains and market towns, ready to meet the next animal that grazed too close. Human ingenuity created vaccines and regulations. The organism replied with an austere patience. If one sits very still in the long arc of this history, one hears an unsteady lullaby composed of small scenes: a Mesopotamian scribe dictating an order to burn a hide, a Roman tanner rubbing bitter herbs into his palm, a 19th century farmer watching a stranger in a lab coat vaccinate his sheep under a grey sky, the silent, invisible descent of a spore into a furrowed field and the yawning quiet that follows. These are scenes of strategy and logistics as much as of suffering. They are the contours of a long human project to make landscapes and economies less hospitable to a tiny organism with a stubborn life plan. The patient spore teaches a final lesson. It insists that human responses must be institutional and long-term: surveillance of animal health, careful handling of animal products, veterinary and occupational protections, and prudent land use. It insists that knowledge, once won, must be transposed into policy and practice. the narrative of anthrax in antiquity through to the birth of modern microbiology and into an understanding of its ecology is therefore not merely a catalogue of events. It is a slow accumulation of tools and institutions, of small practical measures and the occasional grand experiment that together transformed an ancient terror into a more manageable hazard. The organism remained, our ability to live with it improved. So the tale closes this stretch of the road, not with a dramatic finality, but with a quiet, watchful awareness. A nondescript speck of soil can contain the memory of a dead sheep. A line of trade can carry that memory for thousands of miles. A laboratory can make the invisible legible and offer a remedy. Knowledge, like the best of medicines, works slowly. The spores wait. We do not pretend to have exercised them. Instead, we build fences around our knowledge. Veterinary vaccines, trading standards, burial practices, hands washed in the river long before soap, but also hands gloved and clinical in the modern factory. History in its unhurried way shows how societies learn strategies that are at once practical and moral. How to prevent the next wave of losses, how to protect livelihoods, how to keep the wheels of trade turning without consigning people to old dangers. Anthrax, in its quiet, patient way, has been a teacher of human organisation, and its lessons are practical, uncompromising, and long-lived, like the spores themselves. The great mills and tanneries of the long 19th century had a sound and a smell all their own. The rhythm of belts and carding combs like a distant heartbeat, the hiss of steam and the plash of scouring vats, and everywhere the dry, powdery drift of animal fibres and dust that would hang in the light like a pale, indifferent snowfall. It is in that dust, in that bland, stubborn powder that would settle into the seams of pockets and the hems of coats, between the layers of stacked hides and under the tongues of moored ships, that the story of industrial anthrax most often began. The Industrial Revolution did not invent anthrax. It simply set spores to a larger choreography, concentrated risk in particular trades and towns, and made places where a single infected hide could make 100 men ill. From the crowded lofts of Bradford and Leeds to the tanneries of Rouen and the leather quarters of Florence, whole occupations found themselves in the daily company of Bacillus anthracis. The woolen towns of northern England, which burgeoned in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as merino fleeces from Australia and New Zealand, coarse wool from the Caucasus, and raw bales from the American prairies flowed into the textile economy, became notorious for clusters of sickness among the men who sorted and carded raw material. They called it wool sorters' disease, an old name, the kind workers and authorities prefer because it places blame on a job rather than a microbe, because it makes a pattern that you can stare at and legislate about. The medical accounts used a sharper phrase, pulmonary anthrax, when the lungs filled and a man went from cough to collapse in a way that made horse veterinarians, glove makers and industrial surgeons trade notes across the same table in different towns. The processes of tanning, of scouring and carding, and of felt making had always been messy and hard on the body. What changed was scale and speed. Where a small village tannery had once handled a few hides at a time, the new factories took bales and barrels, turning the raw and the rotten into marketable leather, hair, glue and wool. Carding machines turned fibres into airy masses, combing and sorting raised clouds. Ships plied longer routes and ports bristled with hides and fleeces from far corners of empire. Argentina's cattle hides, South Africa's hides and pelts, the fat hides of the American Midwest and the endless rolls of Australian wool. Trade itself became an engine of contamination, a benign-looking commerce carrying a lethal, invisible hitchhiker in the interstices of the trade. Physicians and public health officers learned to map these occupations the hard way. In the mid and late 19th century, there were case series, pairs of men in the same loft, both stricken, whole families exposed because a bundle of imported hair was opened in the kitchen. Cutaneous anthrax, known in clinical law as malignant pustule, charbon or anthrax in the skin, had long been familiar to rural communities where butchers and shepherds dealt with diseased animals. What industrialization added was the inhalational form, the wool sorter's disease that came not from a knife or a lick of blood, but from a man breathing thin dust that his lungs could not refuse. When the first convincing microbial explanations arrived, they only sharpened the picture. Spores that could survive voyage and storage, resisting sun and salt and time, only to be breathed into a worker's lung when a sack was opened or a bale was carded. The discovery that transformed the science came in 1876, when Robert Koch, working with the meticulous clarity that made modern bacteriology possible, isolated Bacillus anthracis, cultured it, and demonstrated its role in disease. Koch's methods, staining, isolation, the idea that a specific germ could cause a specific disease, turned what had been anecdote and occupational folklore into something that could be tracked, measured, and importantly, controlled. Yet discovery is not the same as amelioration. The mills and docks that paid the wages where the spores circulated were part of broader economic systems. Interventions had to pass through shareholders, municipal councils, boards of trade, and the labour of thousands. Social responses came in fits and starts. Early factory legislation in Britain, the Factory Acts of the 19th century, the growth of municipal boards of health, and later the creation of inspectorates, began to address the harshest physical risks of mechanised work. But anthrax posed a peculiar challenge. It was not only a hazard of cramped hours and poor light, but a hazard that could be carried halfway round the world in a bale of wool that could lie dormant for years in soil or on a hide. The tug-of-war between economic interest and public health was visible in every regulation and in its enforcement. Merchants and importers protested against costly disinfection requirements. They argued that strict controls would hamper trade and leave them at a competitive disadvantage. For many governments, especially in the era before a strong international architecture of animal health, the balance tended to favour commerce. Slowly, the weight of evidence and the pressure of worker agitation pushed the needle. Occupational medicine, still a nascent field, began to take anthrax seriously as a workplace disease. Municipal authorities in heavy wool towns instituted procedures. Scouring plants were installed to remove grease and dust from raw wool. Steam and water were used to wash fibres where possible, and better ventilation systems were recommended to carry dust away from open breaths. In some ports and processing centres, imported hides and fleeces were subjected to fumigation or insisted upon certification. Inspectors learned to look for suspicious consignments. Legislation emerged in some places to recognise anthrax as an occupational hazard, entitling victims to compensation or to company liability. The Workmen's Compensation Acts that spread through industrialising states in the late 19th and early 20th centuries meant that managers could no longer entirely ignore diseases associated with the workplace without fiscal consequence. These were incremental gains. Occupational reform often arrived only after tragedies, and it arrived unevenly. In Britain and parts of Western Europe, where public health institutions were growing and where veterinary services received attention, the frequency of industrial anthrax declined over the course of the 20th century. In other regions, colonial outposts, frontier ranching zones, and later the newly independent nations of the global south, prevention lagged. Here, the logistical difficulties of vaccinating vast flocks, the cultural practices that led people to butcher animals that had died rather than waste meat, and the absence of routine veterinary inspection kept anthrax alive as an occasional dreadful hazard. Public health campaigns did their best with the tools available. Posters and pamphlets taught butchers and flock owners about the dangers of handling animals that had died suddenly. Municipal abattoirs and slaughterhouse inspection systems reduced the chances that a diseased carcass would enter a market. The nascent science of veterinary medicine, bolstered by figures such as Pasteur and later National Veterinary Services, began to cross the species barrier in practical ways. Protect the animals and you protect the people who depend upon them. International cooperation, halting at first, gained momentum in the interwar period. The Office International des Epizooties, founded in Paris in 1924, provided a forum to talk about animal diseases across borders and to standardise reporting. Those efforts, married to improvements in processing, enclosed carding machinery, linen masks for sorters, mandated cleaning of warehouses, reduced exposure in many industrial centres. The decline, however, was not elimination. The same particles that had made the wool trade efficient, the durability of the fibre, the resilience of hides, made anthrax spores stubborn neighbours. In places where removal of contaminated soil or disposal of an infected carcass was impractical, spores persisted for decades. And because the industry itself had become global, an outbreak in an isolated ranch could, through trade, become an occupational hazard a hemisphere away. Industrialization had concentrated people into patterns and places that disease could predictably exploit. Public health unravelled those patterns slowly, often in the face of political and economic resistance. If Chapter 4 is the story of concentration, of how industry and commerce packaged and moved risk, then the next part of the tale is about the slow, sometimes halting medical response, the art and science of prevention, the discovery of countermeasures that would change anthrax from a frequent death in a sorter's family into, more often, a treatable infection. It begins, famously, with Louis Pasteur standing in the fields at Pouilly-le-Fort on a summer day in 1881, surrounded by a cluster of sceptical peers and plenty of curious reporters. Pasteur had been working with attenuated cultures of microbes as a principle. His demonstration that vaccinated animals could resist a virulent inoculation became a public act with a political weight as well as scientific one. The scene, a clear clinical proof that an immunological defence could be induced, hurried veterinary medicine into a new era. Pasteur was not the only figure in this small revolution. Jean-Joseph-Henri Toussaint in France had shortly before Pasteur's public demonstration produced a killed bacteria vaccine and published results that suggested active protection. The quarrels over the priority that followed were as human as any scientific quarrel. They also mattered less than the fact that farmers, municipal veterinarians and colonial administrators now had a tool. The introduction of preventive vaccination for livestock, particularly in countries that could afford systematic campaigns, bore fruit. In towns and regions that instituted regular vaccination of sheep and cattle, outbreaks dropped markedly. Where vaccination programs faltered through war, economic crisis or political disorder, anthrax reappeared with a stubborn regularity. Parallel with vaccines, serum therapy and the nascent field of immunology opened other avenues. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the age of antitoxins. Emil von Behring's work on diphtheria and tetanus antitoxins set a tone for what immunotherapy could be. For anthrax, the picture would prove more complex because the organism produces a potent toxin with several components and because the disease often advanced swiftly. Research pursued antitoxins and immune sera for anthrax through the early decades of the 20th century. These therapies showed promise in some experimental contexts and in individual cases, but they were partial answers. Their manufacture and distribution were cumbersome, and they were, in an era before refrigeration and rapid transport, hard to scale. Then came antibiotics. Penicillin, discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928 and brought to mass production and clinical use during the Second World War, changed everything generically for bacterial disease. For anthrax, antibiotics, penicillins first, later tetracyclines and fluoroquinolones in the mid to late 20th century, meant that cutaneous anthrax could, with timely treatment, be spared the fatal choreography that had marked earlier centuries. Systemic forms could be arrested if medicine reached them early enough. Inhalational anthrax, the most fearsome form for human patients, still carried a heavy mortality risk, but the existence of effective antibiotics transformed the odds. The practical upshot in public health terms was profound. Medical treatment could be a backstop to prevention. Where vaccines and veterinary controls were imperfect, antibiotics reduced the toll. Human vaccines followed a slower path. Governments and armies, faces to the possibility that their personnel might be at risk, supported the development of vaccines for people whose work or service put them in harm's way. In the mid-20th century, national research institutions in the United States, the Soviet Union and elsewhere developed human anthrax vaccines that were employed for laboratory workers, veterinarians and, at times, military personnel. These vaccines were not without controversy. Early formulations produced side effects. Questions about efficacy, safety and the ethics of mandatory inoculation surfaced repeatedly. Supply chain and logistics problems meant that mass vaccination was rarely a viable policy in peacetime except for targeted groups. Thus, the classic public health maxim persisted. Prevention at the animal level would always be the most cost-effective method to protect human populations. Those constraints were not merely technical, they were economic and political. In resource-poor settings, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Indian subcontinent and portions of Central Asia, veterinary services were weak or absent. Vaccines were scarce, cold chains unreliable, and removal of carcasses by burning or deep burial often impossible or culturally unacceptable. The result was that anthrax remained an embedded risk in pastoral economies. Outbreaks sometimes impoverished communities and, in tragic and avoidable ways, exposed people who handled or butchered dead animals. International agencies and NGOs, slowly, learned to weave anthropological sensitivity into their campaigns. Don't eat the dead animal makes sense in principle, But in a place where meat is food and famine a constant spectre, such advice collides with hard need. In these contexts, the utility of veterinary vaccination, of simple diagnostics, and of building local capacity proved and still proves to be the difference between sporadic deaths and recurrent endemic disease. By the time the world turned its attention reluctantly toward the militarization of biology, there were already routines in prevention and a clearer understanding of the limits of medicine. Those routines, veterinary vaccination, slaughterhouse inspection, occupational safeguards, and, in the clinic, antibiotics, would shape responses when states began to imagine anthrax not only as an occupational hazard or a livestock scourge, but as a strategic tool. Wartime logic had long looked for asymmetries. In the first global conflict, the First World War, the idea of biological sabotage began to move from the realm of rumour into policy. Horses and mules still hauled artillery and kept supply lines alive. If an enemy could damage an opponent's beasts of burden or their foodstuffs, the impact could be strategic. Histories of the Great War document accusations traded between belligerents, furtive plots, alleged blows struck against livestock, concerns in the logistics offices about contaminated fodder. The evidence of systematic, state-directed biological attacks in that period is often fragmentary and contested. There were certainly clandestine operations and attempts at sabotage, and the very fact that governments feared biological attacks haunted military planning. What is certain is how quickly states learned to take biological possibilities seriously. Interwar diplomatic efforts culminated in the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which forbade the use of chemical and biological weapons in war. That agreement reflected a visceral revulsion, the memory of mustard gas and other chemical carnage, and a bipartisan recognition that biological agents presented an ethical and strategic abyss. But the protocol had limits. It banned use, not research, not stockpiling, and not the development of defensive measures. Those loopholes, and the uncertainties of the next war, would be what most militaries exploited. In the Second World War, biological research moved into laboratories with budgets, and anthrax itself featured prominently in classified thinking. The British programme, centred at Portendown in Wiltshire, took a deliberately empirical approach. Can anthrax be delivered in a form that will infect a livestock? Can it be controlled? An operation with an almost Victorian sobriety, one might imagine men in trench coats arguing about animal pathogenesis and meteorology, led to a practical experiment on Gruinard Island off the northwest coast of Scotland in 1942. On that windswept, sheep-populated island, scientists tested the lethality of anthrax under field conditions. The results were unambiguous in their grimness. The island became contaminated, sheep died, and the place was quarantined for decades thereafter. The tests had a strategic paper trail too. The British military considered Operation Vegetarian, a plan to drop anthrax-contaminated cattle cakes on German pastures, to collapse food supplies and render territory untenable for the enemy. The plan was never executed. Concerns about retaliatory use and the moral barrier to deploying such an indiscriminate agent loomed large, but the very existence of the plan tells us how militaries reasoned about anthrax as a weapon of economic and psychological attrition. Across Asia, the picture grew darker. Japan's Unit 731 in Manchuria, led by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, carried out ruthless experiments throughout the 1930s and into the war years. Unit 731's program included research into anthrax among other pathogens, and it involved deliberate infection experiments on prisoners and civilians, as well as attempts to weaponize disease for use in China. The human cost was appalling. After the war, the ethical scandal deepened, when some Japanese researchers were reportedly granted immunity in exchange for data of dubious scientific value, but undeniable operational interest. These bargains, political bargains made in the fraught aftermath of conflict, left open wounds and shaped the narratives of accountability for decades. The United States, by the mid-1940s, was also experimenting, consolidating research at what became Camp Dietrich in Maryland, beginning in 1943. American programs, like the British, were framed in terms of deterrence and parity. If biological agents could be used by an adversary to disrupt armies and societies, then the United States had an obligation to know their capabilities and limits. Post-war, that knowledge became the foundation for expanded Cold War programs. For the Soviet Union, the wartime years and the decades that followed saw massive investment in offensive capabilities as well. Anthrax, with its hardy spores and potential to deny territory, and foodstuffs featured in that logic. The rationales driving military investment in anthrax were not all purely sinister in abstraction. There were reasoned debates in staff rooms and laboratories about the efficacy of incapacitation versus killing, about whether an economy could be damaged more by destroying livestock than by destroying factories, about the moral and legal consequences of introducing long-lived contamination to a battlefield. There were also the darkly practical arguments. Anthrax was cheap to reproduce relative to the industrial costs of other weapons, spores persisted in the environment, and the psychological impact of an invisible, odourless threat was valued by strategists who understood terror as a component of modern war. Yet the same characteristics that made anthrax militarily interesting made it strategically dangerous in uncontrollable ways. Spores did not respect lines on a map. An actor who contaminated an area risked contaminating neutral territory, civilians, and their own forces. These practical and ethical dilemmas pushed public attitudes and diplomatic efforts toward prohibition and control, even as secret programs continued. By the end of the Second World War, the institutional architecture of biological research had been indelibly altered. Laboratories that had begun as ad hoc wartime projects matured into national centres of expertise. That expertise fed both defensive and offensive programs throughout the Cold War. The long shadow of those decisions appears in later controversies, and in incidents that would bring the subject from the realm of military planners into public conscience. The story of anthrax, once the province of rural veterinarians and mill surgeons, had become inseparable from the larger story of 20th century science and power, how the technologies designed to secure armies and nations could also imperil civilians and peacetime commerce, how the same discoveries that enabled vaccines and treatments could be repurposed toward harm. So the threads run: the industrial mills that concentrated dust and work, the veterinary and public health campaigns that sought to unmake that concentration, the laboratory breakthroughs, from Koch's plates to Pasteur's demonstration, that offered methods of prevention, and finally, the strategic imagination that saw in anthrax a weapon, and in that weapon a set of moral and tactical dilemmas. It is a history of trade and toil, of laboratories and bureaucracies, of commerce bending public health, and of states bending science towards security. And through it all runs the quiet fact that anthrax has always been a disease of relationships, between human beings and animals, between employers and workers, between consumers and the far-flung markets that feed them, and between nations in an age where the borders are porous to both goods and germs. The story is practical, bureaucratic, sometimes terribly mundane, and that is precisely what makes it so instructive. The threats that troubled armies and empires were often the same threats that had troubled sheepfolds and tannery yards for generations. The responses, regulation, vaccination, veterinary control, and eventually concerted international law, were and remain social as much as scientific, because anthrax has never been merely a matter of bacteria. It has always been a matter of how people organise work, trade and responsibility across the distances that tie us to animals and to each other. Gruinard Island lay like a small, obstinate coin of granite and heather tossed into the North Atlantic, a private place with sheep and a name that belongs to maps and fishermen rather than ministers and laboratories. In the summer of 1942, when the war was still a hard, patient thing of ration books and blackout curtains, British scientists from Porton Down carried to that coin of land a secret they had been ordered to examine. The urgency then was not abstract. Britain had watched modern war unfold across Europe and wondered what kind of weapons industry the enemy might bring to bear, and whether the calculus of total war allowed answers that, in peace, would have seemed monstrous. The result was a small clinical experiment that would cast a very long shadow. Porton Down, the Wiltshire establishment whose name has become synonymous with clandestine science, was by then the heart of Britain's biological warfare inquiry. Paul Fildes and other military pathologists there talked in terms familiar to any frontier research. Agent stability, delivery mechanisms, dosages that would incapacitate cattle, incapacitate supplies, ruin an enemy's food chain. That thinking coalesced into a plan, at once grim and oddly bureaucratic, called Operation Vegetarian. The idea of contaminating cattle pastures with anthrax-laced cattle cakes to produce famine and social collapse behind enemy lines. The fantasy of famine made moral philosophers wince. The logistics made generals nod. Before something so consequential could be considered, an empirical question had to be answered. Did anthrax actually behave as a weapon would require when exposed to the weather and the ground. For that, they needed a place remote enough to protect civilians and close enough for their scientists to reach. Gruinard fitted the bill. In August 1942, teams from Porton Down transported cultures, munitions prototypes and observers to the island. They tended flasks and grew spores, they loaded dispersal devices and placed sentinel sheep on the hills, and thus watched, with the clinical detachment of technicians and the anxious fascination of men who know they are at the edge of something new, how animals succumbed. The tests proved two things with terrible simplicity. First, anthrax spores were staggeringly hardy. They survived the wind and the salt spray, and the peculiar cold of the Hebrides to do what their biology commanded. Second, the spores could be delivered in a manner that affected grazing animals in the way strategists had predicted. The scientists left the island with answers, and the War Office with a troubling useful knowledge. What followed was a pattern familiar in the technology of war: collection of data, compartmentalization of knowledge, and the quiet imposition of a new geography of hazard. Gruinard was quarantined. Notices were nailed to the shore and the logs. No landing, no grazing. The owner of the island found his land in the hands of the state, and for decades the narrow line of coast remained a place people passed without stepping on. The white dust, the spores in the soil did not go away. They did what biological agents, once released into the right environment, often do: they waited. Time did not erase them. That waiting was, in itself, a form of violence. It turned property into liability and place into a lesson. Secrecy guarded this outcome. Porton Down's work was wrapped in ministerial silence. Wartime priorities and Cold War habits both encouraged the belief that knowledge of certain threats should remain a government matter. For the islanders and the farmers around Gruinard Bay, the state's silence was not protective but alienating. They were left with a line on a map and a sign. The story became a footnote, an occasional item in a dossier, until public sensibilities shifted and environmental activism found a vocabulary to challenge not only nuclear fallout but the residues of biological experiments. By the 80s, Britain's own memory of the war and the expanding public appetite for transparency produced a slow cascade. Journalists asked awkward questions, scientists testified, and campaigns pressed for remediation. What had been deemed necessary wartime research was suddenly assessed in peacetime terms: who owned the land, who paid for the cleanup, who accepted responsibility for a hazard that had been created for the state's strategic advantage. Remediation, when it finally came, had the awkwardness of belated practicality. In 1986, the Ministry of Defense undertook a cleanup. Soldiers and civilian specialists returned to Gruinard with drums of chemical solution and the patient, unspectacular machinery of decontamination. They soaked the surface and the upper soil, and then they flushed what they could with seawater until samples gave the kind of negative readings bureaucracies require. The island was formally declared safe and returned to private hands in 1990. For some, this was closure. For others, it was a reminder that science, when married to strategy, can create dangers whose reckoning stretches beyond the political cycle that authorized them. The remediation itself became part of the debate. Had authorities done too little, too late? Had they been right to keep the experiment secret? Had they been criminally negligent in exposing a place to spores that outlived the memory of ministers? Gruinard thus became a compact case study in the long afterlife of wartime research. An island turned into an experimental field, then an exclusion zone, then a contested site of politics and law. It spoke simply and stubbornly to questions far broader than its own coastal bounds. Who counts the ecological costs of weapons testing? Whose land becomes the laboratory of a state? Do tactical gains justify environmental permanence? The white powder did not present these questions politely. It merely existed until someone could no longer ignore that existence, and then the state and the public were forced into a late accounting. It is worth looking at the logistics as much as the metaphor. The British programme, unlike an industrial wartime armoury, was small by comparison to later state efforts. Small teams, a handful of facilities, limited budgets couched in phrases like defensive research. But even a modest programme produced outsized consequences because of what it taught the strategists and because of the biology it handled. The spore's longevity made every laboratory's disposal protocols an ethical problem with a distant due date. Precaution, so often invoked, so seldom plainly applied, was hard to maintain when national survival was the argument, and when secrecy muffled oversight. The story of Gruinard is not merely an anecdote of misadventure, it is the anatomy of how a wartime imperative becomes, in peacetime, an ethical and environmental inheritance. Across the continent and a few decades later, another anthrax story unfolded with a different register, but the same ingredients of secrecy, error and political consequence. Sverdlovsk, a city whose original name was a paean to revolution and whose modern name is Yekaterinburg, sits in the industrial Urals, a place of factories, railheads, and the dense hum of Soviet industry. On a spring day in April 1979, a plume of biological hazard, one would later read it that way, escaped from a military microbiological facility on the outskirts of the city. The result was a cluster of illnesses and deaths that at first were muffled by confusion and then by an official story that fit a different politics. Soviet authorities blamed contaminated meat. The official line, gastrointestinal anthrax from tainted meat, was both plausible to a public used to blaming food for disease and convenient for a state attempting to hide military culpability. But epidemiology is a stubborn sort of detective. It reads patterns from where cases occur, who took the illness, and how the disease behaved. Western analysts and a handful of Soviet doctors who could not fully contain their unease began to see a different shape in the data. Cases appeared downwind from the military compound. They were concentrated not in neighbourhoods clustered around slaughterhouses, but along a narrow ribbon that matched the direction of prevailing winds on the days in question. Victims were, in significant measure, not consumers of a contaminated food, but people whose workplaces or rooms lay along that plume. The pattern suggested an aerosol release. For a decade, the Soviet state held to its story. The secrecy of Soviet bioweapon science, its facilities, its budgets, its workforce, was an essential feature of Cold War intelligence. Only with the loosening of the Soviet system in the early 1990s did investigators gain access. And only then, under political pressure and the precariousness of a collapsing regime, did some of the truth emerge. In 1992, President Boris Yeltsin, seeking to present a new face to the West, acknowledged that the Sverdlovsk outbreak had indeed resulted from an accidental release from a military facility. He invited Western scientists to visit. Matthew Messelson of Harvard, a chemist turned policy maven who had long argued for disarmament and verification measures, led a team that examined records, autopsy reports, and the geography of the outbreak. Their conclusions, published and tempered with scientific caution, corroborated what epidemiology had suggested. A leak, most likely from a poorly maintained exhaust filter on a high containment suite, had vented spores over a part of the city and killed dozens. How many died is still a question that haunts the episode. Soviet records, even when opened, are partial and fragmentary. Families buried alone, and not all deaths were registered as anthrax under the old rubric. Estimates vary. The figure most frequently cited by investigators like Messelson is in the dozens, commonly at least 6 deaths, but other counts have suggested higher numbers. The precise toll matters to historians and to families. It matters less, perhaps, to the larger lesson the incident taught the world. Secrecy can protect a state's immediate image, but it also impedes remedial action, undermines international trust, and amplifies the danger of inadvertent release. Sverdlovsk resonated beyond its grim perimeter because it exposed a disquieting reality. Under the facade of a treaty that ostensibly forbade offensive biological weapons, major states could, and did, maintain clandestine programs. The Soviet project had a name in leaked documents and the testimony of defectors: Biopreparate. What appeared at first glance to be a civilian network for production of vaccines and legitimate biological products was, according to accounts from insiders such as Kanatjan Ken Alabekov, who defected to the United States in the early 1990s, an industrial-scale research and production complex with military directives. Alabek's testimony and other sources painted a picture of a program that spanned several dozen facilities, employed tens of thousands, and sought both to weaponize agents and to create countermeasures. Sverdlovsk was not a single aberration. It was a glimpse at the underside of a system that continued to run despite the rhetoric of disarmament. The political fallout was complex. For those who wanted the Biological Weapons Convention, the treaty signed in 1972, to be more than an aspirational text, Sverdlovsk was damning. The convention, long in gestation and finally adopted at a moment when both superpowers publicly agreed to renounce biological weapons development, was short on enforcement. It prohibited development, acquisition, stockpiling and transfer of biological agents and related delivery systems for hostile purposes, but it lacked the kind of intrusive verification apparatus that, say, the Chemical Weapons Convention would later develop. Sverdlovsk delivered an unwelcome confirmation of what many suspected. Treaties can paper over reality if the will to verify is absent. That truth leads, naturally, to the story of the treaty itself and the persistent shadow programs that have tested its limits. The Biological Weapons Convention, BWC, opened for signature in 1972 and entered into force in 1975, was an extraordinary moral and political act. It declared that biological weapons were beyond the pale, a category of arms that civilized states would not pursue. Its language was deliberately comprehensive. Any bacterium, virus, or biological agent used for hostile purposes was prescribed. The drafters hoped to create an international norm to match the one they had forged against chemical weapons. But the drafters were also constrained by politics and by the inscrutable nature of the technology they sought to ban. The BWC did not establish an international body with inspection powers and enforcement teeth. The reasons were both technical and political. Inspections of biological facilities are intrusive in a way that risks exposing proprietary research and national security secrets, and the asymmetry of trust in the Cold War made states unwilling to accept those risks on a broad scale. So the BWC rested, in large part, on reciprocity and a nascent form of confidence building. States could and would sign. They would declare they were in compliance, they would meet and exchange views. But the treaty's architecture left open the yawning problem of verification. The dual-use character of biology, where a fermenter can be used to brew beer or to culture Bacillus anthracis, where geneticists sequence pathogens to make better vaccines and the same knowledge could facilitate manipulation, meant that telling the difference between defensive and offensive work is technically difficult. Laboratories grew larger and more sophisticated with the progress of molecular biology. Industry investment made certain equipment commercially ubiquitous. If a facility had stainless steel bioreactors, clean rooms, and a staff of trained microbiologists, was it legitimate or covertly sinister? The answer often lay in the state's dossier, not in the hum of its equipment. Despite these constraints, the pattern of states' behaviour was not uniformly honourable. As already suggested, the Soviet Union pursued an extensive offensive programme long after the BWC's ink had dried, and the revelation of biopreparat scale in the 1990s was one of the great wake-up calls for the international community. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, ran a programme in the 1980s and early 1990s that would later be exposed by the UN inspections after the 91 Gulf War. The head of its biological effort, Rehab Taha, dismissively nicknamed the Germ by Western press, oversaw work on anthrax and other agents. South Africa's apartheid government undertook Project Coast under Wouter Basson in the 1980s, where chemical and biological capabilities were developed and targeted at perceived enemies of the regime. Libya acknowledged programs in the early 2000s during its partial reintegration with the West. Unit 731's atrocities in the Japanese Empire in the 1930s and 1940s remain the grim ancestral memory for modern debates, a demonstration of scientific cruelty unleashed in wartime. These programs, various in scale and method, share a common feature. The temptation to treat biology as just another category of armament, and the willingness to keep the work hidden until defeat, collapse, or defection makes the lid fall off. The BWC's drafters had envisioned at some point adding verification. Negotiations toward a verification protocol unfolded in the 1990s and came to a head in 2001. That was a moment when the world seemed poised to strengthen the treaty's scaffolding. Long, fraught talks sought to fashion an inspection regime that would be technically credible and politically acceptable. The demands were almost paradoxical. States wanted inspections that would detect violations without unduly exposing industries to espionage or revealing legitimate intellectual property. They wanted a system that would catch a clandestine fermenter, but would not interfere with a vaccine manufacturer's confidential processes. In the end, the United States, citing concerns that the protocol as drafted could not adequately protect sensitive information and could be gamed by proliferators, refused to accept it, and the protocol collapsed. The disappointment was deep. The opportunity to build verification while the political moment allowed was lost. After that collapse, the international community played with other tools: confidence-building measures, Voluntary exchanges of information about biodefense programs, declarations of national facilities, and data sharing were offered as partial remedies. The Australia Group, established in the 1980s in reaction to both the Soviet program and Iraq's early proliferant instincts, sought to harmonise export controls for dual-use biological and chemical goods, hindering those who would seek to procure equipment under false pretences. The United Nations Security Council produced Resolution 1540 in Tanvor, a broad mandate to stop non-state actors' acquisition of weapons of mass destruction capabilities, including biological materials. The set of international and national layers, export controls, criminal laws, oversight mechanisms in universities and professional norms in biology create a lattice of prevention, but each strand has holes that clever actors, or those willing to break laws, can slip through. Technological change has not simplified matters. The rise of synthetic biology, cheap DNA synthesis, and gene editing tools like CRISPR have lowered the barrier to manipulating organisms in ways that would have been the stuff of well-funded government programs a generation ago. A dozen years ago, a small team could not hope to sequence and reconstitute a virus. Today, outsourced synthesis and open databases make aspects of that work more accessible. That means the BWC's architects' original worry that biology is inherently dual-use and therefore hard to police has only grown more acute. At the same time, the very tools that increase risk also increase our ability to detect. Microbial forensics, sequencing, isotopic analysis, and databases of laboratory signatures give investigators new ways to attribute an outbreak to a source, but attribution is not trivial and never instantaneous. Even with a high-resolution genome, a pathogen's lineage can point to a laboratory lineage, but not to a specific individual who made the decision to weaponize. The moral is practical. The faster science moves, the more states must invest in transparency, cooperative norms, and the political will to police themselves. And yet, even with all these complications, the human logic remains plain. States fear surprise. They fear being outflanked by adversaries who might use a means of war that would change the strategic equation. So they hedge, they prepare defences, they fund research that might also create capabilities, and they argue for secrecy in the name of security. The problem for international law is that secrecy suffers from the same disease as the agents themselves. It persists. As long as large states believe they need clandestine options, the BWC will struggle to be more than a statement of intent. Sverdlovsk reminded the world how dangerous that hedge can be. Gruinard reminded it how long the consequences of a decision can linger. What does it mean, then, to live under a treaty that is both morally ambitious and practically porous? It means that the moral suasion embedded in the BWC must be paired with practical measures that build trust without unduly compromising secret lives of legitimate research and commerce. That is harder than it sounds. A vaccine plant must not be indistinguishable from a covert production line. Industries must accept inspections, and states must accept that protecting commercial information does not require elbowing aside the public's right to know when items of grave danger are at issue. The lessons of the 20th century, Gruinard's long quarantine, Sverdlovsk's cover-up and admission, Biopreparat's industrial scale, are not simply cautionary tales. They are, in plain administrative terms, the reason for stronger national oversight, better international intelligence sharing, and perhaps most critically, a cultural change in the life sciences that treats secrecy and ethical vacancy as incompatible with long-term security. One finds, in the archives and memoirs that emerged after the Cold War, the language of regret and rationalization in roughly equal measure. Scientists who worked at Porton Down or in Soviet institutes often recalled their work as a grim necessity, a professional duty in a world that was bent on killing and that therefore required any measure of defense. That rationalization is understandable in a certain register, but it also reveals a common failing, a failure to foresee how technology scales and how unintended effects amplify. Gruinard's spores did not simply vanish because war had ended. The Sverdlovsk plume did not confine itself to those who had authorized its release. These are the kinds of failures institutional arrangements are designed to mitigate, but institutions need design, funding, and above all, political willingness to enforce constraints that sometimes bite. So where are we today in the shadow of these episodes? The BWC remains a central moral instrument, a near-universal pact that sets the international norm against biological warfare. Yet it remains, for reasons both technical and political, an incomplete project. Shadow programs have not been completely eradicated. They have at times receded into quiet corners only to resurface in new guises. The tools of science have democratized some mid-capabilities once reserved for states. They have also enhanced detection and attribution. Politics in the end decides how those tools are used. The policies debates that follow Gruinard and Sverdlovsk are, at heart, about responsibility. What obligations do states have to prevent environmental contamination born of military research? And what obligations do they have to curb the existence of clandestine capabilities that risk accidental release? Those questions have legal, scientific and moral dimensions. The answers will not be found in treaties alone, nor in the laboratories of single nations, but in a global conversation that pairs humility about the limits of control with rigour in oversight and transparency. Until then, islands will sleep under the memory of dust, and cities will turn quietly into case studies of contagion and cover-up. The white powder leaves marks that are not merely biological. They are political and ethical inscriptions that demand a public accounting. This is not to underplay the argument some will inevitably make, that deterrence, secrecy and technological preparedness preserve peace by raising the cost of attack. They will insist that a capable state is a secure one, and that to show one's hands is to invite trouble. That argument is not without logic, but history tells a counter-story, that secrecy breeds error, that accidents ripple beyond their intention, and that the residues of a policy decision can bind generations that did not consent to it. Gruinard and Sverdlovsk, in their very different ways, show what happens when the balance tips towards secrecy and expedience. One is an island, one is a city, both are warnings. When the review conferences of the BWC gather in Geneva, and when the scientists who build the tools of life convene in their well-lit halls, they inherit this genealogical memory, that biological agents are stubborn, that institutions are fallible, and that the public interest is not a secondary consideration, but the fulcrum on which legitimate policy must balance. The challenge is institutional and cultural. It requires inspection regimes that respect commercial confidentiality while detecting fraud. It requires national laws that criminalize misuse and fund robust transparency programs. It requires an international architecture where trust is verified, not merely asserted. It also quietly requires remembrance, an honest accounting of past tests on islands and past leaks in cities, so that the arrogance of the present does not become the next decade's contamination. In the dim, late hour, when a historian's work often feels like bedtime storytelling, the stories of Gruinard and Sverdlovsk, and of the treaty that sought to deny them, are not merely catalogues of mishap. They are parables about decisions and their duration. They teach, with a voice that is both soft and insistent, that the choices states make in the name of security can become enduring legacies, some of them tragic, some of them political, and all of them demanding of accountability. If we wish to keep the promise of the Biological Weapons Convention alive, we must be honest about its limits, and resolute in designing institutions capable of enforcing the moral compact it embodies. Until then, the white powder will remain a shape in our shared memory, a substance that refuses to be only scientific and becomes, inevitably, profoundly human. In rooms that hummed like slow machines, where fluorescent light softened the edges of stainless steel and the odour of bleach was as constant as weather, the story of modern anthrax forensics quietly took shape, not in the flash of headlines, but in the hush of instruments and the folded carefulness of gloved hands. It is easy to imagine forensic science as a straightforward path from sample to answer, but the truth is more like a long river that gathers tributaries. Epidemiology, microbiology, molecular genetics, law and habit, all flowing together, muddying one another, and sometimes revealing a bedrock of clues. For Bacillus anthracis, that slow accumulation began with 19th century microscopes and reached, by the opening years of the 21st century, to the tiny differences in letters of DNA that could be read only by machines invented in the previous decade. Environmental sampling is the first, plainest act in that river. It sounds almost prosaic. A soft swab brushed across an envelope flap, a wipe taken from the inside of a sorting machine, a vacuum sock drawn across a floor seam. But those gestures are freighted. The sample is the single thread from which the whole tapestry will be judged. How it is collected, who touched it, whether it was sealed and logged and moved in a way a courtroom will later accept, These mundane facts can be the difference between a lead and a dead end. The Laboratory Response Network, created before 2001 but hardened by the events that followed, formalised some of that choreography. It taught public health labs to run rapid screening tests so clinicians could get answers and treat patients, while flagging material that might be preserved for criminal investigation. That dual mandate, rapid public health response on the one hand, rigorous evidentiary practice on the other, is a constant tension. Speed can save a life. Haste can destroy a case. The early laboratory methods were classical and stubbornly simple. Culture a sample, watch colonies grow, stain and look under a microscope for the telltale rods and capsules that identify bacillus. Immunoassays could detect protective antigen proteins, bacteriophages would lyse susceptible strains, and animal models, cruel but once unavoidable, provided confirmation. Those methods were important, but slow, and sometimes inconclusive when the sample was tiny or degraded. The introduction, in clinical and public health settings, of polymerase chain reaction, PCR, in the 90s, changed the tempo. DNA could be amplified from a few molecules into a signal that told you whether the organism's genetic signature was present. The Laboratory Response Network supplied real-time PCR protocols that allowed state labs to answer within hours the burning question: anthrax, yes or no? But detection, saying this is anthrax, is not the same as attribution, saying this anthrax came from that place. For attribution, the field called upon the strain typing. Bacillus anthracis is comparatively homogeneous. Its evolutionary clock ticks slowly. Unlike some bacteria that swap genes like cards and mutate quickly, anthrax holds its identity. That scarcity of variation made the forensics harder. Early typing methods included phage typing and plasmid profiles, and later SNP assays and multiple locus variable number tandem repeat analysis, MLVA, gave investigators more to work with. MLVA looked for differences in the number of repeating DNA motifs at select loci, fingerprints of sorts, and proved useful for grouping isolates into clusters. It was faster and more informative than many predecessors, but it was also blunt when you needed a scalpel. The arrival of whole genome sequencing, not merely reading a gene or two but the organism's complete instruction book, was transformative. Suddenly, investigators could look for one-off mutations, the tiny single nucleotide polymorphisms that would distinguish one laboratory's stock from another's. In practice, this meant building libraries of reference isolates from research collections and environmental samples, sequencing them and comparing their genomes to those taken from attack material. If a rare mutation showed up in both the attack sample and a lab stock and nowhere else in the databases, the odds that they shared a common source increased. This is the genius and the peril of genomics in attribution. When you find a unique signature, it feels like you've found a fingerprint. But microbes do not keep neat records. Genomic signatures can be rare simply because we have not sampled enough. They can appear in different places because of lab transfers, unrecorded exchanges, or contamination. And the statistics that translate a shared SNP into a narrative of origin are complicated, requiring assumptions and probabilities rather than certainties. The Anthrax investigation made those abstract points painfully concrete. Investigators compared the letter spores to repositories of Bacillus anthracis held across the United States and abroad. They used MLVA first to show the attacks involved the so-called Ames strain, a lineage widely used in American biodefense research, and named in the fashion of taxonomists who sometimes confuse origins with place names. The Ames strain's ubiquity was both an advantage and a complication. It meant many labs had specimens to compare, but it also meant that identity alone did not point a finger. Only with more detailed genomic resolution, whole genome sequencing, and careful analysis of rare mutations could examiners start to narrow the circle. Even when the genomes gave promising leads, they did not stand alone. Scientific evidence is a partner in a court of many voices. Access logs, notebooks, emails, procurement records, work schedules, and the simple fact of whether someone could have handled the organism at a given time. Pain of custody matters in ways that are rarely dramatic but always decisive. An envelope sampled, resealed, and sent to another lab with no clear documentation becomes a story with missing pages. In Amerithrax, samples passed through local hospitals, state labs, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Army's USAMRIID, and the FBI, with different priorities in each place. A hospital's first duty is to save a patient. A federal agent's first duty may be to preserve evidence. When the pressure of lives and politics comes into play, the two aims sometimes tug in different directions. Cross-contamination was the stealthy villain of many a laboratory drama that unfolded in the wake of anthrax cases. Spores are hardy and peripatetic. They cling to fibres, survive vacuuming, ride in filters, and can be carried inadvertently on gloves and clothing between benches and buildings. Laboratories that worked with aims, strain isolates in the routine course of research had the potential to seed false positives into environmental swabs and into their own culture plates. Maintaining negative controls, documenting every transfer, and preserving original samples in secure conditions are necessary but not always practiced with the same rigour where public health demands immediate answers. The lesson that emerged, painfully and repeatedly, was that forensic best practice cannot be an afterthought. It has to be built into every stage of sample handling, from the swab in the field to the sequencer's output. Legal challenges shadowed the science. How many times had evidence been touched before the laboratory sealed it? Which agency had the authority to subpoena records? Who would speak to the press and what would they say? Forensic scientists learned that their results were interpreted through the lens of courtroom scrutiny. Chain of custody notes could be subpoenaed, lab notebooks could be cross-examined, and statistical inferences could be turned into rhetoric about certainty or doubt. The National Research Council and other bodies would later call for standards, for shared databases, for transparent metrics on how rare a mutation must be before it is considered probative. The field of microbial forensics matured by being forced to answer not only what the microbe was, but what the microbe could legitimately be said to say about its origin. There is also an institutional story here. After 2001, governments invested in centralizing bioforensic capability, secure facilities, centralized sequencing centers, and archives of reference strains were built or expanded. New policies governed who could access select agents. Training programs stressed accountability. Information systems were designed to track samples from collection to courtroom. The United States formed or empowered bodies, such as the National Bioforensic Analysis Center, to provide high-containment facilities where investigators could perform comparative genomic analyses under strict evidence-handling protocols. Internationally, collaborations grew as scientists realized that attribution was rarely local. Microbes do not respect political boundaries, and the best reference data come from many countries. All of this, sampling, typing, sequencing, documentation, it sounds technical, and it is, but the human margin is always present. The scientist who chooses which aliquot to sequence, the technician who forgets to log a transfer, the investigator who decides which leads are followed and which are set aside. These small human decisions shape big outcomes. Attribution is therefore not purely a product of machines. It is an art and a responsibility. Genomics can point to a likely source. It cannot by itself read intent. When the mail began to carry not only bills and postcards but death in white powder, the country felt its democracy in the way we feel the floor beneath our feet, sometimes steady, sometimes suddenly untrustworthy. The letters of October and November 2001 arrived in a mood still raw from September 11th, and the timing mattered. People had been walking through a new world of heightened alertness for only a few weeks when envelopes became suspect. The first known victim was Robert Stevens, a 63-year-old photo editor employed at American Media Inc. in Boca Raton, Florida. He fell ill, and in a twist that would later be memorably cruel, became the first person in the United States known to die from inhalation anthrax since 1976. His death on October 5, 2001, punctured whatever distance some Americans might have felt from the idea of biological assault. The letters sent to media outlets and to two United States senators, Patrick Leahy of Vermont and Tom Daschle of South Dakota, were ordinary in appearance, the kind of soft envelopes people had learned to ignore. Inside they contained powder. On the outside they bore typed addresses and, in some instances, ominous slogans. When those envelopes were opened, in newsrooms and in Senate mailrooms, powder plume and frightened people followed. Some recipients experienced cutaneous infection, painful, treatable, while others inhaled the tiny, treacherous spores into lungs where they could cause a grave systemic disease. In total, 22 people were infected during the autumn of 2001, 11 suffered inhalational disease and 11 suffered cutaneous disease. 5 people died. The numbers are clinical, but the impact was cultural. For weeks, the Postal Service felt like a minefield, and the envelope, the most prosaic of civic instruments, suddenly felt dangerous. Postal contamination was not limited to those who opened the letters. Sorting machines that chew through thousands of pieces a day spat spores into the air, depositing them on rollers, guides, and in the crevices that make up their mechanical hearts. Mail handlers, men and women whose job requires muscles, rhythm, the intimate knowledge of machines, found themselves on the front lines. Facilities were closed. One key site, the Mail Processing Center known as Brentwood in Washington, D.C., became notorious in press accounts for the scale of its contamination. Decontaminating and restarting such facilities was logistically complex and costly. The Hart Senate office building, with its proximity to the political machinery of the nation, became another symbol of vulnerability when a letter addressed to Senator Daschle was discovered to contain anthrax. For a time, the Capitol's mail system was paralyzed, forcing members of Congress to rely on hand delivery and suspicion. Media organizations, which had been early targets, responded with both practical measures and introspection. Newsrooms that thrive on immediacy found themselves delayed and constrained. Some networks moved to separate mailrooms, adopted protective protocols, or suspended mail operations entirely. The economy of fear touched small business as well, with couriers rerouted, shipments delayed, and a general low-level panic that made people handle yesterday's unease as if it were a new discovery. The Postal Service itself faced not only the immediate human cost but long-term shocks, lost revenue, the expense of decontamination, and a sudden existential question about how to secure a national mail network. The social atmosphere in those months was a curious admixture of stoic endurance and visible anxiety. One could walk into a cafe in Manhattan and see a barista and a congressman reading the same paper, both tracking updates, both thinking of mail in a new way. Dark humour surfaced, as human beings often do in the face of danger, jokes about not opening envelopes from ex-lovers, or about scanning every parcel for the wrong kind of white dust. Underneath the humour, though, lay suspicion that threaded through communities and labs alike. Early conjectures about responsibility were loud and varied. Was this the work of foreign terrorists capitalising on the nation's vulnerability after September 11th? Was it domestic, the act of a deranged individual? The letters themselves, which in some cases bore inflammatory rhetoric, suggested ideological motives to some and an attempted misdirection to others. The investigation that followed, Anthrax, as the FBI named it, was the largest and most complex in the Bureau's history. It was a multi-year affair that brought together hundreds of agents, analysts, and scientists. In the early days, investigators cast a wide net and explored international leads alongside domestic possibilities. The forensic work, as described earlier, progressed from culture confirmation to molecular typing to deep genomic sequencing. The first molecular typing showed the letter's material to be the Ames strain, a finding that narrowed the field not by pointing to a single person, but by pointing to a common research lineage. That narrowing set the stage for an investigative drama where science and suspicion jockeyed for primacy. Media speculation became a force of its own. The public had a new thirst for meaning in a time of fear, and names were sometimes thrown forward with more certainty than the evidence warranted. One early suspect who attracted national attention was Dr. Stephen Hatfill, a US-trained physician-scientist whose life became fodder for tabloids and cable shows. The FBI's interaction with the press regarding Hatfill sparked controversy. He was publicly characterized as a person of interest, a label that carried stigma. Hatfill fought back in court and ultimately received a settlement from the government and in a separate defamation suit from media organizations. The episode underscored a lamentable reality. Names whispered in the press can become brandished as facts long before investigators have built a case. The focus later shifted to a US Army scientist, Dr. Bruce E. Ivins, a senior researcher at the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick. Ivins, like many in his field, had long experience with anthrax in lab settings and was professionally competent. He also displayed behaviour that some colleagues found troubling. Late-night lab work noted on logbooks, visits to the post office at odd hours, emails that were read by investigators as eccentric. In 2008, as the FBI was preparing to make an arrest, Ivins took his own life on July 29th. The shock of his death, a life that had been dedicated to studying the organism now ending under a cloud of suspicion, refracted the case into new moral complexities. The Department of Justice subsequently announced in August 2008 that its investigation had identified Ivins as the sole perpetrator. Because he had died, they declined to seek charges. The Bureau completed a fuller public summary of its investigative conclusions in 2010. It leaned heavily on genomic evidence that linked the spores in the letters to a particular flask of anthrax, catalogued as RMR129, that had been under Ivins' control. It also considered circumstantial evidence, his access to relevant materials, his work patterns, and lines in his communications. For some, the report provided closure. For others, it raised uncomfortable questions. The scientific community, never monolithic, split in its reception. Some scientists praised the forensic ingenuity that had exploited rare genetic differences. Others, including panels convened by the National Academy of Sciences, cautioned that the genomic work, while valid, did not by itself prove how the spores were prepared or by whom, and that alternative explanations had not been exhaustively ruled out. The National Research Council's review in 2011 was particularly measured. It acknowledged that the microbiological and genetic analyses performed by the FBI and its partners were powerful tools, and that they had advanced the field. Yet it also pointed to weaknesses in the broader investigative framework. The statistical inferences were not always coupled with analyses that could quantify the likelihood of alternative scenarios. Chain of custody issues and gaps in documentation hampered definitive legal conclusions, and other potential sources of the Ames strain could not be completely eliminated. Those critiques did not indict the scientists' competence, so much as remind the public that science rarely speaks with the single voice juries and newsrooms demand. The Anthrax saga illuminated the limits of what laboratories can tell us, and highlighted the necessity of integrating science with careful investigative work. Genome sequences can exclude possibilities and can make some scenarios more plausible, but they are part of a mosaic. The human record of access, the notebooks, the shipping forms, the procurement requisitions, these materials sometimes tell the truer story of a person's opportunity and means. The case also showed the cost of premature conclusions. A federal scientist's life devastated by suspicion, a public flailing for answers, an entire postal system temporarily unmoored. These are not just footnotes. They are the toll exacted when attribution is rushed by political pressure or when scientific nuance is flattened in the theatre of headlines. Out of that tense, often painful experience came reforms. Governments and laboratories tightened controls on select agents, demanding better inventory, stricter personnel vetting, and more rigorous auditing. Forensic protocols were codified: who collects a sample, how it is labelled, how it is stored and transported, and how laboratories document every transfer. Investment flowed into sequencing centres and reference databases so that future investigations might be less eager to generalise from small data sets. The field of microbial forensics matured because it had to. The stakes of error were too high. Yet some questions linger, not as a failure of science, but as a human remainder. Motive in the Anthrax case remained, for many observers, elusive. The laboratory signature could be argued. The mental state of the central suspect was examined. But a neat narrative, the isolated villain struck, a quiet man acting for a small reason, fits uneasily with the messy evidence on the table. The case became, in a way, a parable about our era. Advanced tools can read the letters of diaspora, they cannot read the letters of motive, only suggest where to look next. In the afternoons and nights after anthrax entered the national consciousness, thousands of samples were taken. Machines beeped in the quiet hum of laboratories, and scientists compared sequences with the patience of librarians matching marginalia. They found useful differences and frustrating similarities. They improved methods and rewrote standard operating procedures. They learned that the envelope that had once been a civic conduit could be a crime scene, and that a sample's path from field to sequencer must itself be a carefully documented narrative. The months of October and November 2001 remain a study in how a nation responds when an invisible threat becomes visible. There was, in the immediate aftermath, a practical emergency: treat the sick, secure the mail, decontaminate facilities, and a wider social emergency, the rupture of ordinary trust. The anthrax letters exploited a universal assumption that the paper and parcels we exchange are neutral, that the post office is a benign artery of society. When that trust phrase, society must make quick choices about precaution and liberty, about the balance of speed and deliberation. The Anthrax investigation was an attempt to answer those choices with evidence. It revealed how much evidence the modern sciences could assemble, and how much still depended upon human judgment. So the story ends, for now, in the laboratories and in the courtrooms of public opinion. New sequencing platforms have since been built, databases expanded, and protocols tightened. The name Amerithrax belongs to a forensic turning point, the moment when genomic precision met the messy reality of human institutions, of leaky chains of custody, and of the very human propensity to leap to conclusions. That collision spawned advances and reforms, but it also left a residue of doubt that tastes faintly metallic in the mouth when you consider the lives affected. We learned that microbes tell a part of the story, and that scientists, however brilliant their instruments, must work hand in hand with patient investigators who document, who corroborate, who map the human terrain surrounding the samples. And we learned that the envelope is both object and symbol, a thin membrane between the private and public, between life and danger. In the quiet that follows, the forensics of anthrax remain a discipline that walks softly. Sequencing readouts arrive, like whispers that must be interpreted with care, and the verdicts they suggest must be couched in the humility of probabilistic language. As with any good bedtime tale, the moral is gentle and a little vexed. Certainty is rare, the truth is patient, and the work of tracing a microscopic agent back to its human maker is as much about people as it is about genes. The fall of 2001 taught governments an awkward, expensive lesson about the way fear could be quantified and legislated. Anthrax was not simply a microbe in those envelopes, it was a drafting instrument that rewrote executive orders, budgets, and the architecture of public health. When letters laced with spores floated through the United States Postal Service and into the hands of newspaper offices and Senate mailrooms, the response could not be deliberate. It had to be massive, visible, and mechanical, because the problem itself was invisible and patient. In the months and years that followed, the United States in particular reorganized its institutions, remade its laws, and infused enormous sums into a new biodefense estate. The Public Health Security and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act, signed by President George W. Bush on June 12, 2002, tightened control over dangerous pathogens, expanded quarantine and inspection powers, and demanded that the medical and food systems be made more resistant to deliberate attack. The Homeland Security Act, enacted in late 2002 and creating the Department of Homeland Security, folded an enormous set of security functions into a single cabinet department whose first secretary, Tom Ridge, would preside over a bureaucracy now tasked with defending against biological threats in the narrowest, most literal sense, to guard ports, mailrooms and infrastructure, and to make biorisk visible on security maps. Those legal instruments were the blunt end of a sharper, more technical response. Project BioShield, signed into law on July 21, 2004, carried an unmistakable promise. The federal government would buy, at scale, the medical countermeasures it feared it might need. Project BioShield created a procurement fund, a guarantee to industry and a signal to the research community that the state would not merely ask for vaccines and therapies but would pay for them and stock them in the strategic national stockpile. The numbers involved were not modest. Over the first decade after 2001, federal spending on biodefense moved from a toe in the water to a deluge. NIH, CDC, and later the newly formed Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, BARDA, became conduits for billions in research, development and procurement. BARDA itself emerged from the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act on December 19, 2006, alongside the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, an institutional signal that the science of countermeasures would now be married to procurement, logistics and emergency operational planning. The strategic national stockpile grew in both variety and scale. Ciprofloxacin and doxycycline, the antibiotics that a frightened public could pronounce, were bought by the pallet. Millions of doses were assembled beneath the watchful eye of programs that had once been small and narrowly funded. Vaccines were acquired and remanufactured. Biothrax, the anthrax vaccine developed in the late 20th century and produced by companies that weathered controversy, became an artifact of national planning rather than merely a tool for selected laboratory workers or soldiers. As regulatory frameworks adapted to the new reality, the Food and Drug Administration moved to authorize countermeasures under the Animal Rule, the regulatory pathway finalized in the early 2000s, that allowed approval where human efficacy studies were impossible or unethical, turning animal models and carefully curated surrogate endpoints into the basis for licensure of antitoxins and novel therapeutics. In the following decade, products such as monoclonal antitoxins were developed and placed on government contract. Their approval would rely on carefully constructed animal data, a legal and scientific compromise that reflected both ingenuity and unease. Surveillance and detection systems multiplied. The Laboratory Response Network, a CDC-led consortium of public health laboratories first codified in the late 1990s, was reinforced and expanded, its molecular diagnostics modernized to recognize Bacillus anthracis DNA more quickly, to move from culture to polymerase chain reaction and then to whole genome techniques. Environmental monitoring programs proliferated. BioWatch, an air sampling initiative run by the Department of Homeland Security, deployed detectors in dozens of metropolitan areas beginning in the early 2000s in the hope of catching aerosolized agents before illness bloomed. Biosense and other syndromic surveillance tools built on electronic health records and emergency room data to detect clusters of respiratory distress or unexplained skin lesions that might suggest a biothreat. The United States National Bioforensics Analysis Center and other analytic hubs were created to place microbial forensics under one roof, where DNA signatures, growth characteristics, and isotopic analysis might be used to trace an agent back to a laboratory or a geographic source, a forensic dream and a logistical nightmare, because the science of attribution was still maturing even as law enforcement insisted on decisive narratives. Every technological response carried a governance question. The select agent regulations, already in place and significantly strengthened after 2001, became a primary mechanism for controlling who could work with dangerous organisms. Registration requirements, inventory audits, enhanced physical security, and biometric access systems funneled more people through background checks. The federal select agent program stitched together CDC and USDA oversight. The National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, created in the early 2000s, began to advise on the thorny question of dual-use research, work that could be crucial for public health but might also lower the barriers to deliberate misuse. Institutional biosafety committees grew more formal. The Model State Emergency Health Powers Act, drafted in late 2001 and circulated widely to state legislatures, promised states the legal authority they said they needed to close schools, seize private property, or mandate vaccines during declared emergencies. Some states adopted versions of it, but not without outcry from civil liberties groups. The legal toolkit for public health swelled. The debate over whether it had swelled too far swelled with it. The anxiety that followed Amerithrax left fingerprints on libertarian and liberal constituencies alike. High-profile confrontations between law enforcement and scientists crystallized the tension. The FBI's Amerithrax investigation, helmed under Director Robert S. Mueller III, and enduring through an arc of years, brought criminal inquiry into research laboratories and, for some researchers, into careers. The case named and then discounted individuals. Stephen J. Hatfill was publicly stigmatized as a person of interest and later received a multi-million-dollar settlement after years of legal wrangling and reputational damage. In August 2008, the FBI announced that its agent of consequence, Bruce E. Ivins, a biodefense researcher at USAMRIID in Fort Detrick, had been the only perpetrator. Ivins had died by suicide in late July 2008, before charges could be filed. The Department of Justice formally closed its investigation in 2010, a conclusion that left as many questions as it answered. A National Research Council review in 2011 criticised aspects of the scientific case and called for more rigorous standards and transparency in microbial forensics. The lesson here was not merely scientific, it was institutional. Law enforcement had acquired powers to search, seize, and call into question laboratories' integrity. That shift deterred some scientists and changed the culture of openness that had long been a hallmark of public health. Corollary to this was the rise of securitization, the comfortable language of defense that reframed disease as an external military threat and public health as a theater of counterterrorism. The creation of security-focused budgets and programs meant that the priorities of intelligence and the priorities of epidemiology were often set in adjacent offices, rather than in the same room. With that came the risk of crowding out long-term investments in routine health infrastructure and international capacity building. Money flowed to advance molecular detection, to air sampling arrays, and to procurement of countermeasures. Comparatively less might go to local public health departments, primary care clinics, and the slow work of building trust with communities that are the first line of detection and response. The result was paradoxical. The apparatus for detecting an intentional attack gained sophistication, and yet the social and health systems that make populations resilient, the clinics, the community health workers, the trust networks, did not always enjoy an equal boost. This segmentation would become painfully visible in later epidemics, when speed of local response mattered more than the latest detection algorithm. The international dimension cannot be overlooked. The Biological Weapons Convention, signed in 1972 and ratified by scores of nations, remained weak in verification. In the wake of 2001, the United States withdrew support for a draft verification protocol to the BWC, citing concerns about intelligence leaks and proprietary information, a decision associated with then Under-Secretary of State John R. Bolton, and that pullback underscored the friction between national security and arms control. At the same time, the World Health Organization revised the International Health Regulations, IHR, in 2005, a move intended to strengthen cross-border surveillance and reporting after SARS had exposed the world's vulnerability to fast-moving respiratory threats. The International Health Regulations created obligations for countries to build core capacities for detection and reporting, and the Global Health Security Agenda, launched in 2014 by the United States with partner countries, aimed to move those obligations into practice. But the politics of assistance and sovereignty, the deep inequality between laboratories in North America and laboratories in the Global South, and the suspicion that assistance could be a cover for surveillance or advantage meant that cooperation was always a diplomatic exercise as much as technical aid. And while governments built networks and stockpiles, the rest of society built rituals. Mailroom protocols, postal irradiation at government complexes, the installation of suspicious package procedures in office buildings and schools, training for hazardous materials teams, and the choreography of hazmat suits and quarantine tents became everyday items on municipal checklists. The bills were substantial. The Brentwood Postal Facility in Washington, D.C., the Hart Senate Office Building, and other sites required expensive decontamination and long closures. The method most often chosen for deep cleaning within enclosed postal and office environments, gaseous chlorine dioxide fumigation or vaporized hydrogen peroxide in later years, left its own practical and fiscal scars. Many companies contracted for decontamination and compensation. Many employees had to endure months of uncertainty. The mail itself was altered. New screening, new rules, new behaviour. People learned to recognise the small brown envelope, the powder's fine whisper of white dust, as a possible messenger of disaster. When the dust settled, it did not mean calm. It meant that white powder entered the public lexicon as an affordance for both genuine alarm and malice. Hoaxes, deliberately sending flour, talc or baby powder in a letter to provoke a shutdown, proliferated. In the United States and the United Kingdom and elsewhere, thousands of suspicious package calls were made. Schools were emptied, office buildings were cordoned off. In Britain, the word white powder and the ritual of holding a benzene-tinted vial to the light conjured images that television news replayed nightly. Hazmat teams moving like a ballet of caution. Local police holding a public perimeter with an intensity previously reserved for hostage scenes. That repetition created a new cultural grammar in which any ambiguous substance could be a crisis. The social cost was subtle but deep. Time wasted on hoaxes, the anxiety of mail carriers, the new normal of distrust toward anonymous correspondence. The media amplified and humanized the threat in competing ways. News organizations, legitimately reporting a genuine terror, also turned the white powder into a persistent visual and narrative motif. Photographs of postal workers in blue suits with clear plastic masks, of taped-off mailrooms, of Senate offices fumigated under the ultraviolet light of hazard, found their way to front pages and evening segments. At the same time, fiction and non-fiction lent their own kilowatts to public imagination. Richard Preston's The Demon in the Freezer, 2002, and The Cobra Event, 1998. Before it, books that dramatized biological terror, helped to translate technical anxieties into stories that lay readers and policymakers could digest. Films and television shows that had already trafficked in biomedical dread found new audiences. The net effect was a feedback loop. Media attention produced public alarm justified policy investment produced new artifacts for the media to show. It is telling that the trope of the white powder outlived the specific incidents that birthed it. Actors in workplace disputes turned to white powder hoaxes as a way to terrorize. Pranksters and political actors exploited new anxieties. The symbol became portable and durable. That portability had social consequences that survived the immediate crisis. Scientists with foreign-sounding names found themselves under new scrutiny. Research teams composed of international scholars discovered obstacles to collaboration as visa checks, shipping restrictions, and export controls tightened. The very measures intended to keep societies safe had the unintended consequence of narrowing the scientific commons at the moment the world most needed collaborative intelligence about pathogens. The select agent rules and the rise of security clearances did not erase the need for rapid research exchange when outbreaks arrived. They complicated it. Biologists felt the squeeze between the duty to publish, to share findings that could save lives, and the duty to withhold specific details that might facilitate misuse. These were not merely procedural debates. They were ethical ones that required new institutional forms. From there, the story moves inevitably into contemporary risk. Climate change has introduced a dimension that the post-2001 planners could not fully anticipate: the reawakening of pathogens frozen into permafrost. In July 2016, the Yamal Peninsula in northern Siberia experienced an unprecedented anthrax outbreak after a heatwave and thawing of a decades-old reindeer carcass burial ground were implicated in the release of viable spores. The regional health authorities and the Russian government mounted a response that included mass vaccination of both animals and humans. Reports suggested that thousands of reindeer died and that dozens of people were hospitalized, with at least one child among the casualties. The event was not merely a local tragedy, it was a demonstration project for a climate disease nexus. Spores that can persist in the soil for decades are a different kind of problem when warming accelerates their opportunity to meet hosts again. The lesson is ecological as well as logistical, that pathogens do not respect maps designed by human anxieties, and that preparedness must account for environmental change as well as deliberate release. And then there is technology. The last decade has delivered tools that render the biological toolbox both more powerful and more diffuse. Gene editing, epitomized by CRISPR after 2012, and the falling cost of DNA synthesis have democratized manipulation of genomes. The synthesis of horsepox virus in 2017 by a team that wished to better understand smallpox vaccine development produced alarm precisely because it demonstrated what was technically possible outside of elite, centralized laboratories. The 2011-2012 controversies over gain-of-function research into H5N1 influenza showed that the scientific community, regulators and funders could not assume consensus about when research should be allowed, when it should be paused, and when it should be published. The pause, the debate, and the eventual creation of new funding review processes and moratoria on certain lines of inquiry were explicit acknowledgements that the dual-use problem is not hypothetical. It is present, granular, and procedural. Ethically, these developments place the world at a crossroads. One path is an age of fortress science, layers of security, closed labs, exported samples tightly controlled, and publication censored in the name of safety. The other path is an age of transparent science, open data, collaborative verification, and scientific diplomacy. Both have risks. Fortress science can slow discovery, produce blind spots, and breed distrust between nations, while transparent science can lower barriers to misuse by actors with malign intent. The policy challenge is to design governance that navigates between these extremes with humility and proportionality. Mechanisms that screen dangerous work, that monitor high-risk materials, that create robust vetting of synthesis orders without criminalizing routine scholarship, that protect whistleblowers, and that ensure that emergency powers are bounded, reviewable, and time-limited. What might such a framework look like in practice? First, it must be global. Microbes cross borders. Only global cooperation can supply timely detection and equitable countermeasures. Strengthening the WHO's role in coordinating outbreak investigation and in facilitating rapid, transparent information sharing is essential. Reinforcing the international health regulations and providing resources to bring low- and middle-income countries up to core capacities should be a top priority. The Global Health Security Agenda offers a template. Investments in laboratories, workforce training, and real-time reporting systems can reduce the probability that an outbreak, accidental or deliberate, becomes a catastrophe. Countries should also pursue confidence-building measures under the Biological Weapons Convention, voluntary transparency, joint exercises, and cooperative investigations that lower the incentives for secrecy and the temptation to assert unilateral defensive strategies that erode trust. Second, governance must be adaptive and science-informed. Institutions like the NSABB have a role, but they must be empowered with transparent procedures and the means to convene expertise quickly. Oversight of dual-use research should be upstream. Grants should be reviewed not only for scientific merit but for foreseeable misuse, with multidisciplinary inputs including ethicists, community representatives, and security experts. Gene synthesis companies should operate robust sequence screening against curated threat databases, and governments should support research into safe-by-design approaches that reduce virulence while preserving knowledge. The animal rule and similar regulatory pathways should be used with due caution, ensuring that animal models translate as faithfully as possible while acknowledging their limits. Third, investment must be rebalanced toward public health systems. Stockpiles and antitoxins matter. So do local clinics. The capacity to test, trace, and isolate a contagion early, to communicate with communities in culturally competent ways, and to protect health workers with training and PPE is where lives are saved. Preparedness is more than warehousing medication. It is bolstering routine care, guarantees of surge capacity, and community trust. That trust is fragile and once broken is hard to regain. The indiscriminate securitization of public health corrodes it. Fourth, the legal and civil liberties frameworks deployed during emergencies must be proportional and temporary. The experience with the Model State Emergency Health Powers Act and with the post-2001 emergency measures showed how easily the language of disease control can be made into a blunt instrument for wider social control. Future frameworks should include ex-ante sunset clauses, requirements for judicial review, legislative oversight, and the strengthening of privacy protections for public health data. They should also contain explicit protections against discrimination and mechanisms to ensure equitable access to countermeasures. Finally, there must be a moral recalibration regarding the distribution of countermeasures. Stockpiles that sit idle in rich nations while poor countries cannot access antibiotics or vaccines are not merely strategic vulnerabilities, they are ethical failures. International mechanisms for sharing antivirals, vaccines, and diagnostics in a timely, equitable manner must be bolder and less discretionary. The PIP framework for influenza viruses is one model. Similar frameworks might be imagined for priority agents, with agreed rules for sample sharing, benefit sharing, and technical cooperation. As a historian and a tireless bedtime storyteller, I note a final, quiet irony. Nations spent billions to render the invisible visible, to build sensors, stockpiles, and forensic labs, but the real defense against biological terror has always been slower, quieter, and more prosaic, the work of robust primary healthcare, public trust, and international cooperation. Anthrax taught that the state could be mobilized, that laboratories could be reinforced, and that monies could be moved rapidly when fear demanded it. It also taught that power without prudence breeds unintended consequences, research chilled, civil liberties stretched, and international cooperation complicated by the logic of secrecy. The future, if it is to be wise, must combine the clarity of science with the humility of shared politics. So what should historians and policymakers carry forward as mottos for the next decades? Invest where detection meets humans. Fund local public health workers and equip them with diagnostics. Keep legal emergency powers narrow and reviewable. Build international mechanisms for transparency and stockpile sharing. Embed ethics into funding decisions. Support oversight bodies that include voices beyond the laboratory, social scientists, ethicists, community leaders. And finally, do not mistake the theatre of security for the practice of public health. 100 hazmat suits do not equal a functioning primary care network. A stockpile does not equal trust. If there is a comforting thought in that last sentence, it is this. Microbes, including Bacillus anthracis, are stubborn, patient things. They have taught human societies how to respond before, and they will test us again. Our best hope is to be less afraid and better prepared, to do the slow, patient work of building systems that are durable without being oppressive, cooperative without being naive, and ethical while being effective. That is the policy arc the years since 2001 have sketched for us. It is neither tidy nor complete. It is, however, necessary. Rest now with that knowledge, not because the problem is solved, but because a sober, deliberate set of choices can make the next disturbance less shattering. And because the world, for all its flaws, has learned that the real defence against invisible terror is visible solidarity.